Welcome to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams. Today we're talking about something most equestrians have felt but rarely name out loud, that hollow, grinding sensation when you're convinced you're terrible at this, when every ride feels like evidence of your inadequacy, when you start wondering if you even belong in the barn at all. Here's what I want you to know before we go any further. If you've ever felt this way, you're not doing it wrong. This isn't evidence of some character flaw, and you're definitely not the only one. What you're experiencing has a shape, it has a rhythm, and it might actually be doing something for you that you didn't agree to but desperately need. Let's start with what's actually happening in your body and brain when you hit one of these low points, because it's not just in your head, even though that's where it feels the loudest. When you perceive yourself as failing, especially in a sport where you're responsible not just for your own performance, but for the trust and safety of a 1,200-pound animal, your nervous system reads that as a threat, not a saber-toothed tiger kind of threat, but a threat to your identity, your competence, your belonging, and your body responds accordingly. Cortisol spikes, your heart rate climbs. Sleep becomes harder to come by, which then makes emotional regulation even more difficult, which then makes the next ride feel even worse. You're in a feedback loop, and the loop has a biochemical signature. This isn't melodrama, it's physiology. The same stress hormones that help you respond to danger in the moment become corrosive when they're elevated day after day. And here's the part that matters. When you're already in that state, your brain starts interpreting everything through a lens of threat. A crooked transition isn't just a technical mistake, it's proof you're not cut out for this. A sharp word from your trainer isn't just feedback, it's confirmation that you're failing. Your perception narrows, you lose access to nuance. Everything becomes evidence for the story that you suck. And that story has a voice. It sounds like you, but it's older than you. It remembers every time showing up got you hurt, every time trying hard led to disappointment, every time you were visible and it cost you something. So, of course, you hesitate, you freeze, you start thinking maybe it's safer to just stop trying so hard. That's not self sabotage. That's your nervous system trying to protect you from a pain it remembers. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because what we're describing, this oscillation between feeling competent and feeling like a failure, isn't random. It's not a sign that you're unstable or broken. It's actually baked into the architecture of how athletes develop. Let me explain. When you're learning something new or pushing into a higher level of skill, you're in what we might call a task involving climate within yourself. You're focused on improvement, on effort, on the process. And when you're in that mode, you're generally okay with mistakes because mistakes are information. They're feedback. They're how you learn. But the second your focus shifts to comparison, to how you measure up against others or against some ideal version of yourself, you've moved into an ego involving climate. And in that space, mistakes aren't information anymore. They're indictments. They're proof you're not good enough. Most equestrians toggle between these two modes multiple times in a single ride. You start out thinking about your position, your timing, your feel. Then you glance at the mirror or remember that someone's watching or suddenly recall that your barnmate just qualified for finals, and bam, you're in comparison mode. You're no longer riding, you're performing, and every misstep now carries weight it didn't have 5 minutes ago. This is where the emotional low points start to crystallize, because when you're locked in ego mode, your self-worth becomes conditional. It's no longer about whether you're learning, it's about whether you're winning, whether you're impressive, whether you're enough. And spoiler alert, you will never feel like you're enough in that mode because enough is a moving target when it's defined by comparison. Here's the thing that most people don't tell you. This doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're human. It means you care. It means the sport matters to you. And it also means you're standing at a crossroads where you get to choose how you interpret what's happening. Let's talk about what that choice actually looks like. When you're in the thick of it, when you feel like you're failing, your brain is conducting an appraisal. It's asking, is this a threat or a challenge? And the answer to that question changes everything. If your brain codes the situation as a threat, your body goes into shutdown or hypervigilance. You avoid, you overthink, you pull back. If your brain codes it as a challenge, you lean in, you problem solve, you stay curious. Same situation, different appraisal, completely different outcome. And here's what determines that appraisal: how safe you feel, not physically safe, though that matters too. I'm talking about psychological safety. Do you feel like it's okay to struggle here? Do you feel like mistakes are allowed? Do you feel like you can show up as your full, messy, still learning self without being judged or dismissed or shamed? If the answer is no, your nervous system will keep interpreting struggle as danger, and you'll keep hitting those emotional low points harder and more often than necessary. But if the answer is yes, if you're in an environment where effort is valued over outcome and growth is normalized, then those same low points become different. They're still uncomfortable, but they're not existential. They're navigable. This is why coaching matters so much, not just the technical instruction, though that's obviously important. I'm talking about the relational piece, the way your coach responds when you're struggling, whether they meet you with curiosity or criticism, whether they help you reframe setbacks or compound them with their own frustration. Because here's what the research shows again and again: athletes who have supportive, autonomy granting coaches are significantly more resilient. They recover from setbacks faster. They're less likely to internalize failure as identity. They maintain motivation even when things are hard. And it's not because those coaches are blowing sunshine. It's because they're helping the athlete's nervous system stay regulated enough to learn. They're creating a context where struggle doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're growing. But let's be real, not everyone has that coach. Not everyone has that environment. So, what do you do if you're navigating this largely on your own? You start by understanding that what you're feeling is not evidence of your inadequacy. It's evidence that you're pushing up against the edge of your current capacity, and that edge is where growth happens. It's uncomfortable by design. It's supposed to feel destabilizing. That's not a sign you're in the wrong place. It's a sign you're in exactly the right place, just without a roadmap. So let's build one. First, you need to get granular about what's actually happening. When you say, I feel like I'm failing, what does that mean? Is it that your horse isn't responding the way you want? Is it that you're not progressing as fast as you think you should? Is it that you're comparing yourself to someone else and coming up short? Because those are three different problems and they require three different responses. If it's about your horse, you might need technical help. You might need to slow down and rebuild a foundation. You might need to acknowledge that horses are living, breathing beings with their own nervous systems and their own bad days. And sometimes the struggle isn't about you at all. If it's about your timeline, you might need to examine where that timeline came from. Who decided you should be at a certain level by now? Is that standard realistic, or is it borrowed from someone else's journey? And if it's about comparison, you need to interrupt that pattern fast, because comparison is where confidence goes to die. Here's a hard truth: Most equestrians are not failing as much as they think they are. They're just holding themselves to standards that are punitive and unrealistic. They're measuring their behind the scenes against someone else's highlight reel. They're mistaking a rough patch for a permanent condition, and in the process, they're training their brain to scan for evidence of inadequacy, which means that's all they see. So the first intervention is perceptual. You have to actively look for evidence that you're learning, evidence that you're trying, evidence that you showed up even though it was hard, because that evidence exists. It's just not as loud as the criticism. This is where self-talk becomes critical, and I don't mean toxic positivity. I don't mean lying to yourself about how everything's fine when it's not. I mean talking to yourself the way you'd talk to someone you're coaching, with honesty, yes, but also with respect, with patience, with the understanding that growth is nonlinear and setbacks are data, not verdicts. When you catch yourself spiraling into, I'm terrible at this, pause. Ask yourself, is that actually true? Or is that my fear talking? What would I say to a friend who was struggling with the same thing? Can I offer myself even a fraction of that compassion? And look, I know that sounds simple. It's not, especially if you've been marinating in self criticism for months or years. But here's the thing, your brain is listening to what you say to yourself and it believes you. So if you keep telling it you're failing, it will find ways to confirm that story. But if you start interrupting that narrative, even just a little, you create space for a different story, one where struggle is temporary, one where you're allowed to be imperfect and still worthy of taking up space in this sport. Now let's talk about the part that nobody wants to acknowledge, but everyone needs to hear. Social media is making this worse. I'm not saying delete your accounts, though honestly, that might not be a bad idea for some of you. What I am saying is that when you're already feeling low, scrolling through curated images of other people's perfect rides and championship banners and glowing training updates is like pouring gasoline on a fire, because you're not comparing your reality to their reality. You're comparing your reality to their branding, and you will always lose that comparison. Equestrian culture, especially online, has this way of valorizing the highlight reel while hiding the struggle. Everyone posts their wins. Almost nobody posts the day their horse spooked at the mounting block and unseated them in front of a crowd. Almost nobody posts the week they spent crying in their car after lessons because they felt so incompetent. Almost nobody posts the months of physical therapy and self doubt that came after an injury. So you're left with this distorted picture where it seems like everyone else is thriving and you're the only one who's struggling. And that's just not true. It's not even close to true. But your nervous system doesn't know that. So every time you scroll, you're reinforcing the belief that you're behind, that you're failing, that everyone else has it figured out, and you're the only one floundering. And that belief becomes a lens through which you interpret everything, including your own progress. So if you're in a low point right now, I'm going to invite you to get really intentional about what you're consuming. Unfollow accounts that make you feel inadequate. Mute people whose success feels like a referendum on your lack. Curate your feed so that it reflects reality, not aspiration, because you need to see that other people struggle. You need to see that growth is messy. You need to see that you're not uniquely broken. And while we're on the subject of environment, let's talk about your barn culture, because the people you ride with, the people you train with, the people whose voices you hear in your head when you're alone with your horse, those people are shaping your internal narrative, whether you realize it or not. If you're in a culture that celebrates only outcomes, only wins, only clean rounds, and blue ribbons, You're going to internalize the message that anything less than that is failure. And you're going to hit emotional low points harder and more frequently because you're working against a standard that allows no room for learning. But if you're in a culture that normalizes struggle, that talks openly about setbacks, that celebrates effort and curiosity and resilience, you're going to have a completely different experience. Not because the low points won't happen, they will, but because you'll have language and community around them. You'll know you're not alone. And that knowledge, that sense of shared struggle is protective in ways that are hard to overstate. So, if your barn culture is toxic, if it's all comparison and criticism and unspoken pressure, you need to know that's not normal. That's not what high performance sport has to look like. And you have permission to find a different environment, even if that feels disloyal or scary. Okay, let's talk about the horse because we can't have this conversation without acknowledging that equestrian sport is unique in one very specific way. You are not the only athlete. Your horse is your partner, your teammate, and sometimes your mirror. And that relationship is going to shape your emotional experience in ways that are distinct from any other sport. When your horse is struggling, when they're resistant or distracted or anxious, it's easy to internalize that as your failure. You start thinking, I'm not good enough to help them. I'm not skilled enough to get through to them. I'm making them worse. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes you are contributing to the problem, but often your horse is having their own experience. They're dealing with discomfort or confusion or fear, and it's not about you at all. But because you're in relationship with them, because your nervous systems are in conversation, it feels personal. Your emotional state affects your horse. If you're anxious, they feel it. If you're tense, they brace. If you're frustrated, they shut down. So there's this feedback loop where your low point starts affecting your horse, which then makes you feel worse, which then affects your horse more. And suddenly you're both stuck. This is why emotional regulation isn't just a nice to have in equestrian sport. It's a core skill. You have to learn how to manage your own nervous system so that you can show up as a resource for your horse instead of another source of stress. And that means developing tools, breathing techniques, grounding practices, ways to reset yourself between rides or even in the middle of a ride when things start to spiral. It also means learning how to separate your horse's behavior from your self worth. Your horse having a bad day is not evidence that you're a bad rider. Your horse being tense is not proof that you're failing them. Sometimes they're just tense. Sometimes they're just having a moment. And your job is to stay calm, stay curious, and help them find their way back, not to take it personally. Which brings me to one of the most important questions we can ask when we're in a low point. What is this actually about? Because sometimes what feels like I'm failing at writing is actually I'm terrified of being seen, or I'm grieving something I haven't named, or I'm carrying shame from something that happened years ago that has nothing to do with horses. Our sport becomes a container for all of it. And if we're not paying attention, we start thinking the problem is our half halt, when really the problem is that we've never felt safe being imperfect. This is the deeper work, the work underneath the technical fixes and the training plans. And it's uncomfortable because it requires you to sit with the possibility that your low point isn't really about equestrian sport at all. It's about the stories you've been carrying, the beliefs you've inherited, the ways you've learned to measure your worth. And here's what I want you to hear: those stories aren't permanent, those beliefs aren't facts. You can rewrite them, but you have to be willing to look at them first. So when you're in a low point, instead of just trying to fix it or push through it or pretend it's not happening, pause. Ask yourself, what is this feeling trying to tell me? What old wound is this activating? What part of me feels unsafe right now? And then instead of judging yourself for feeling that way, meet yourself with curiosity, meet yourself with compassion, meet yourself the way you'd meet a scared horse, with patience, with steadiness, with the understanding that safety has to come before performance. Now, let's talk about whether these low points are necessary, because that's the question, isn't it? Do you have to feel like you're failing in order to grow? And the answer is not exactly, but probably yes. Here's what I mean. You don't need to suffer in order to develop. You don't need to be miserable. You don't need to hate yourself into competence. That's not what growth requires. But growth does require discomfort. It requires you to push past the edge of what you already know how to do. And that edge is, by definition, destabilizing. You're going to feel uncertain there. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have moments where you question whether you're capable. And if you interpret those moments as evidence of failure, then yes, you're going to have emotional low points. But here's the reframe: those moments aren't evidence of failure, they're evidence of learning. They're proof that you're doing something hard, that you're not playing it safe, that you're willing to be uncomfortable in service of something that matters to you. And when you can hold that perspective, the low points don't disappear, but they change shape. They stop feeling like endpoints and start feeling like passages, still hard, still real, but navigable. And here's the other piece: athletes who go through these low points and come out the other side often describe them in retrospect as turning points, as the moments that force them to reevaluate their relationship with the sport, to dig deeper, to get more honest, to develop resilience they didn't know they had. So, in that sense, yes, the low points can be generative, not because suffering is noble, but because struggle, when metabolized well, builds capacity. But that only happens if you have the tools to metabolize it. If you're just white knuckling your way through, if you're shaming yourself for struggling, if you're isolating and pretending everything's fine, the low point isn't going to transform into growth. It's just going to calcify into bitterness or burnout. So the necessity isn't the low point itself, it's how you move through it. It's whether you have support. It's whether you can stay curious instead of collapsing into self judgment. It's whether you can ask for help. And let's talk about that for a second, asking for help, because equestrian culture, especially at higher levels, has this deeply ingrained narrative around self sufficiency, around toughness, around just pushing through. And while resilience is important, this version of it is toxic because it conflates struggle with weakness. It treats vulnerability as failure, and it leaves people suffering in silence because they're afraid that admitting they're struggling will mean they don't belong. But here's the truth: the athletes who last, the ones who build sustainable long term careers in this sport, are not the ones who pretend they're fine. They're the ones who build support systems, who talk to sports psychologists, who lean on their trainers not just for technical help, but for emotional grounding, who normalize the reality that this is hard and sometimes you need help navigating it. So if you're in a low point right now, please hear this. You are not weak for struggling. You are not broken for needing support. And reaching out is not a sign that you're not cut out for this. It's a sign that you're taking your growth seriously. Let's get practical for a minute. If you're in a low point right now, here's what you can do. 1. Slow down. I know that feels counterintuitive, especially if you're already feeling behind. But when you're in a low point, your nervous system is dysregulated, and pushing harder is just going to entrench the pattern. So give yourself permission to back off, scale back your expectations, ride with less agenda, Focus on connection instead of correction. Let your nervous system reset before you try to perform. 2. Name what you're feeling, out loud if possible, to someone safe, because when you name the feeling, you take away some of its power. You move it from this overwhelming, unnamed dread to something specific that you can work with. And you also break the isolation. You remind yourself that you're not the only person who's ever felt this way. 3. Find one thing that's working, just one. Maybe your horse was soft in the bridle for 3 strides. Maybe you stayed calm when they spooked instead of escalating. Maybe you showed up even though you didn't want to. That counts. That's evidence. And your brain needs that evidence to start building a different narrative. 4. Check in with your body. Are you sleeping? Are you eating enough? Are you moving in ways that feel good? Because emotional regulation is not just a mental game, it's physiological. And if your body is running on fumes, your emotional baseline is going to be lower, which means everything is going to feel harder than it actually is. 5. Get offline, seriously, even just for a week. See what happens when you're not constantly comparing your internal experience to everyone else's curated external one. See if the emotional volume lowers when you're not being reminded every day of all the ways you're supposedly falling short. And 6, talk to your horse, not in a woo woo way, unless that works for you, but literally. Tell them you're struggling, tell them you're trying. Ask them to help you figure it out, because your horse is not judging you. They're not keeping score. They're just here, present, responding to what you're offering in this moment. And sometimes that simplicity is exactly what you need to remember why you started doing this in the first place. Here's what I want to leave you with. Your low points are not evidence that you're failing. They're evidence that you're human, that you care, that this matters to you enough to hurt when it's hard. And that's not something to be ashamed of. That's the cost of doing something meaningful. You don't have to love the low points. You don't have to be grateful for them in the moment. But you also don't have to let them define you. You get to decide what story you tell about them. You get to decide whether they're proof of your inadequacy or proof of your courage. And you get to decide whether you navigate them alone or reach out for the support that will make them bearable. Because here's the thing nobody tells you: you're allowed to struggle and still belong. You're allowed to be imperfect and still worthy. You're allowed to have bad rides and bad weeks and bad months and still be exactly where you're supposed to be. This sport is hard. It's supposed to be hard. And the low points are part of the landscape, but they're not the whole landscape. They're just the valleys. And you don't live in the valleys. You move through them. And on the other side, there's clarity. There's competence. There's a version of you that knows how to hold both the struggle and the joy without letting either one erase the other. That's what we're building here. Not perfection, not immunity to discomfort, just the capacity to keep showing up, to keep learning, to keep choosing this sport and this partnership, even when it's hard. You're not failing, you're growing. And sometimes those feel like the same thing, but they're not. I'm Esther Adams, and this is Strides to Solutions. Thanks for being here.